Edward later recalled that Stanley Baldwin questioned his planned visits to the depressed areas and that he refused to be deterred. He remembered telling the Prime Minister, "Some of them have been out for 10 years. More than 3 decades later, seated in his Paris home with the BBC journalist Kenneth Harris, the former king made a larger claim. Harris asked whether his collision with the British establishment would have happened even without his marriage to Wallis Simpson. "Yes, inevitable," Edward replied. Harris pressed him. "Even if he had remained a bachelor?" "Yes, definitely." That answer changes the shape of Edward VIII's story, at least in the way Edward wanted it remembered. Wallis Simpson was the immediate cause of the abdication crisis of 1936. His intended marriage to a twice-divorced American became impossible to reconcile with the expectations placed upon a British king and supreme governor of the Church of England. Yet Edward's own late account was that the marriage didn't create the underlying conflict, it exposed one that was already there. The man who gave that answer was 75 years old. The abdication he was describing had happened in December 1936, 33 years before. He was living at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the Bois de Boulogne, Paris, with a small staff, 2 dogs, and a wife who had been the most talked-about woman in the world. Harris had spent several years persuading Edward to agree to the interview. Even the evening before it was recorded, in October 1969, Edward apparently tried to pull out. He didn't. The program, formally titled The Duke and Duchess of Windsor in Conversation with Kenneth Harris, aired on BBC One in January 1970. Around 11 million viewers watched. It went out on BBC Radio 4 in March 1970, and a repeat broadcast followed on BBC One in August. BBC Records pressed the conversation onto an LP the same year. The structure had 2 halves. The first section was a 3-way conversation between Harris, Edward, and Wallis. The second was Harris and Edward alone. The Times reviewer David Wilsworth noted that Wallis did most of the talking in the first half, about children, careers for women, loneliness, and, reportedly, the Duke's habits. Edward took the second half to address the establishment, his father, golf, blood sports, and, briefly, his great niece. One moment struck the program's later biographer Hugo Vickers as especially telling. At a point in the interview, Wallis announced, "We're very happy," and Edward looked, in Vickers's description, suddenly relieved, and fumbles uncomfortably for her hand, which he then holds. Nearly 33 years after the abdication, still needing that small reassurance. Whatever Edward claimed about institutional collision and political conceptions, the decision had cost him something he was still counting in 1969. The recording matters because it gives us Edward's own version of the man he believed he would have been. Not a revolutionary monarch, not a politician with a program, but an independent king whose social instincts and impatience with ceremony were already pulling him into conflict with the system around him. But every claim on this tape is retrospective testimony. It isn't a contemporaneous record of events. It's one man's account of himself, spoken 33 years later, shaped by everything that had happened since: the exile, the Paris years, the wartime governorship, the decades of obscurity, and the slow accumulation of history's verdict on a 326-day reign. That distinction has to stay visible throughout. Edward didn't call himself a reforming king. His memoirs are explicit. "I had no desire to go down in history as Edward the reformer, Edward the innovator. That might have been more to the point." He added that he had no intention of tinkering with the fundamental rules of the monarchy or upsetting the proud traditions of the court. The language he used elsewhere was deliberately modest. He wrote of wanting to throw open the windows a little and let fresh air into venerable institutions. That formulation is most securely found in his memoirs rather than in the confirmed Harris interview transcript, and the 2 sources shouldn't be quietly merged. But both point toward the same self-description, a man who claimed modest, incremental aspirations and explicitly rejected the grander label of reformer. A little, not a revolution. In the Harris interview, Edward called himself an up-to-date king. That phrase sounds larger now than it probably did to him in 1969. He wasn't issuing a manifesto. He was describing a sensibility, a preference for informality over ceremony, for direct contact over institutional distance, for a monarchy that knew what its subjects' lives actually looked like. Some of what he wanted can be glimpsed in smaller, documented changes. During his brief reign, he reportedly worked to reduce or eliminate the use of frock coats at court. He sought to extend the Royal Victorian Order to women. He attempted, without success, to have the Loyal Declaration removed from the opening of Parliament, an oath he considered offensive to Roman Catholics. These were real interventions, but they were adjustments of court style and symbolic practice, not constitutional restructuring. A man who wanted to change the ceremonial language of Parliament wasn't the same as a man with a program for industrial unemployment. He didn't translate his sensibility into a blueprint. He didn't name legislation he would have demanded, ministers he would have dismissed, or welfare policy he would have launched from Buckingham Palace. The absence of that program is the most important fact the interview can't supply. A British constitutional monarch could advise, encourage, and warn ministers in private. Publicly directing policy was another matter. The Crown was expected to remain above party politics, and a monarch who appeared to demand action from an elected government could quickly become part of the political argument himself, his public language embarrassing a government, strengthening its opponents, inviting popular comparisons between royal concern and official indifference, and dragging the institution of monarchy into a contest it was constitutionally designed to avoid. Edward understood that boundary. He said he had political ideas but kept them private because that was the tradition of the royal family. The phrase most often reported from the interview is that he had lots of political conceptions, though the precise wording requires some caution since at least one surviving account suggests ambiguity in the exchange. What is clear is that Edward framed himself as a man with views and the discipline to suppress them in public. The interview never tells us what those views were. Housing? Unemployment? The structure of court ceremony? The relationship between the Crown and its industrial communities? He leaves the content undefined. The map of his private political world remains blank, which means that Edward's self-portrait as a man of political substance rests almost entirely on his own word, without a single named policy, a documented proposal, or a confirmed ministerial consultation to support it. The public record does give us something. Edward, as Prince of Wales, showed genuine, repeated engagement with unemployment, poor housing, voluntary relief schemes, and working-class life. That engagement was documented in the press and confirmed by contemporary observers. But documented concern isn't the same as a governing vision. Edward became Prince of Wales in 1911 and held the title until succeeding his father in 1936. 25 years as heir apparent, during which he became one of the most recognizable men on earth. The face on newspaper front pages, the man whose clothes were copied, whose tours were documented, whose popularity occasionally unnerved the very institution he was supposed to represent. In 1919, he visited slum districts and coal pits in South Wales. The habit of going to places that protocol didn't require him to visit began early and continued. A decade later, in 1929, Sir Alexander Leith, a leading conservative in the north of England, persuaded Edward to make a 3-day visit to the coalfields of County Durham and Northumberland, where unemployment was already severe and the coal industry was in structural decline. The visit was documented, observed, and politically noticed. By January 1932, British unemployment had reached nearly 3 million people. Edward delivered a speech at the Royal Albert Hall, calling on young people to help with unemployment relief. The appeal was directed at volunteers, not governments, but it was public, repeated, and attached to the Crown's most visible face. The voluntary occupational centers and schemes he associated himself with subsequently served approximately 250,000 people by the end of 1933, according to secondary accounts, though the precise number requires primary verification. Those centers provided activity, canteens, workshops, and some structure to the days of men who otherwise had little to fill them. In 1934, Edward reportedly broadcast a proposal for clubs with elected committees, canteens, workshops, and rooms for educational, recreational, and social activities. None of these were empty gestures. They were commitments maintained over years, in public, at some cost to his institutional standing. A royal figure who builds a public reputation around the unemployed invites the inevitable question: if he cares so much, what is he going to do about it? That question had no constitutional answer Edward could give without crossing a line. The problem became dangerous when he spoke in ways that made sympathy sound like instruction. The most famous example arrived after he had become king. On 18 and 19 November 1936, King Edward VIII toured distressed coal and steel communities in South Wales. He visited the Rhondda Valley, Merthyr Tydfil, the Monmouthshire Valleys, and the industrial ruins around Dowlais. The Dowlais Iron and Steel Works had once been the center of a working community. At its peak, it had employed around 9,000 people. By Edward's visit, the furnaces were silent, the workforce gone, and the works themselves standing derelict in the Welsh landscape. Communities that had been built around the works, streets, schools, chapels, clubs, now surrounded empty buildings. At an abandoned colliery, Edward is reported to have said, "These works brought all these people here. Something should be done to get them at work again." That is the closest to a verified wording available. It does not match "something must be done," which became the popular shorthand, but which several contemporary accounts don't support as Edward's exact phrase. Wikiquote marks it as often wrongly quoted in that form. The word damnable appears in later retellings, but can't be traced to any primary newspaper article from the visit. The surviving accounts conflict, and no contemporary headline securely establishes either word as verbatim. What matters isn't the precise verb. The crowd could understand any version of what Edward said. Ministers heard something else entirely. Ramsay MacDonald, then Lord President of the Council, wrote of Edward's South Wales comments in terms that had nothing to do with indifference to the unemployed. "These escapades should be limited. They are an invasion into the field of politics and should be watched constitutionally." The word invasion is important. MacDonald didn't doubt that unemployment was a problem. He doubted whether the king was the right person to make public declarations about it. A constitutional monarch who says publicly that something must be done raises a question. Done by whom? By the government? That government was MacDonald's own. Was the king suggesting it had failed? Was he building a popular expectation that ministers would be held to account? A monarchy can be trusted to represent the national interest above party precisely because it appears to be above party. It loses that position the moment the public starts to treat it as an alternative government. Edward later recalled his Baldwin conversation in the Harris interview. He remembered planned trips to Wales and Northumberland, with Baldwin asking why he was going to the depressed areas when there were other important things to do. Edward later recalled telling Baldwin, "Some of them have been out for 10 years. He then recalled telling Baldwin that Sir Alexander Leith had helped organize the trip. Baldwin, Edward said, gave his approval. But Edward's own account of the conversation ends on a note of genuine unease. He remembered thinking, as he left, that Baldwin was beginning to drag me into politics a little too far." Then Edward adds, in the interview, the line that summarizes his entire predicament as Prince of Wales. "Politics is the one thing the royal family has to avoid, however much they might like to express their opinions." That isn't the statement of a man who didn't understand the constitutional position. It's the statement of a man who understood it and chafed against it, who could see the line and kept walking up to it without quite crossing over. The conversation with Baldwin is Edward's retrospective memory in 1969, not a verified contemporary record. No parliamentary document or official account confirms the precise exchange, the specific itinerary it discussed, or a direct ministerial instruction to cancel a planned visit. What the record does confirm, through the MacDonald Memorandum, is that royal unemployment advocacy was politically sensitive by the mid-1930s, and that senior ministers were watching its constitutional implications. Edward's public style wasn't only words. He associated himself with a particular image of royalty that differed from the formality of his father's court. Harris recalled in the interview that on one occasion, a Rolls-Royce had been provided for Edward when visiting a poor area. Edward refused it. "I didn't think it was a suitable vehicle for that," he told Harris. He had used an ordinary car instead because it was, he said, more suitable. The date and location of the incident aren't securely documented in the available evidence. There is no confirmed account of whoever arranged the Rolls-Royce or their reaction. The story stands as a self-description rather than an independently proved event. But it fits a pattern that is elsewhere attested. Edward wanted to be seen differently from the royalty of a previous generation. He wanted the symbol to fit the visit rather than the symbol to overwhelm it. A Rolls-Royce in a mining district announces one thing. An ordinary car says another. Edward wanted the symbolic register to shift without necessarily changing the underlying institution, consistent with his windows language. Open them a little. Let in some fresh air. Don't rebuild the house. He also had a documented interest in housing close to home. The Duchy of Cornwall, whose revenues Edward drew as Prince of Wales, owned land in Kennington, South London. One scholarly account describes a proposal to convert 80 acres of duchy land into low-cost housing, with Edward seeking city financing for the project. In the Harris interview, Edward recalled a private enterprise housing scheme that he had backed and that the London County Council had blocked. His explanation being that the council didn't want private enterprise to receive the credit. The available historical record does not confirm that motive. No identified London County Council decision or minute establishes that specific rationale. It may be Edward's accurate memory. It may be the way a frustrated participant tends to remember an obstruction after 3 decades. The honest position is that we can't confirm either the LCC's reasoning or the full story of the scheme's failure. What can be said is that Edward had a documented interest in housing on duchy land in Kennington, that he associated himself with an attempt at improvement, and that the attempt didn't produce the result he wanted. The pattern holds across every domain: instinct, public association, intervention, and an outcome that does not resolve into a clean story of compassion versus bureaucracy. By the time Edward became king on 20 January 1936, he was 41 years old and had spent a quarter-century as the most watched prince in the world. He had the familiarity of total public exposure. He had the impatience of a man who had been waiting for his actual role for decades. And he had the sense, not entirely unjustified, though it ultimately misled him, that he understood public feeling better than the court around him. He also had Wallis Simpson. Wallis Warfield had married her first husband, a U.S. Navy officer, in 1916. That marriage ended in divorce in 1927. Her second marriage, to the British-American businessman Ernest Simpson, followed in 1928. By 1934, Edward and Wallis were widely understood to be in a romantic relationship. George V died on 20 January 1936. Whatever anxieties he carried about his son's readiness for the throne, and they were documented, he could no longer voice them. Edward VIII became king. The constitutional problem with Wallis wasn't simply social snobbery, though snobbery was present. As a twice-divorced woman, she was approaching her second divorce with both former husbands still living. Edward, as king, was also the titular head of the Church of England, which at the time didn't permit remarriage in church if a former spouse was alive. A king who married such a woman would be in visible conflict with the institution he nominally led. Beyond the church, there were the dominions. Edward wasn't only king of the United Kingdom, he was king of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State. Their prime ministers were consulted. Several opposed the proposed marriage firmly. Edward proposed a morganatic marriage. Wallis as his wife, but not queen, with no succession rights for any children. Britain had no constitutional mechanism for such an arrangement. Baldwin put the question to the Dominion governments anyway. Most of their responses pointed toward a single outcome. On 10 December 1936, at Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. His brothers, Albert, Henry, and George, signed with him as witnesses. Parliament gave the decision legal effect the following day. That evening, Sir John Reith, the BBC Director General, introduced Edward to the nation as His Royal Highness Prince Edward, the royal title already stripped from king to prince within 24 hours. Then Edward began his broadcast. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. Winston Churchill, then a backbench conservative who had supported Edward during the crisis, had helped polish the final speech. The words were Edward's. Churchill's eye had passed over them, lending them some of the weight of that friendship. With a reign of 326 days, Edward VIII became one of the shortest reigning British monarchs in modern history. He was never crowned. He married Wallis at the Château de Condé in France on 3 June 1937. They had no children. The 1969 interview didn't disavow any of that. Edward accepted that the marriage was the immediate reason for his departure. What he insisted on was that the departure expressed something deeper than a romantic preference, a sustained incompatibility between his vision of what a king should be and what the establishment expected him to accept. His definition of the establishment in the interview is carefully limited. He called it an obscure term he had not encountered until about 15 years before the interview, placing his first real engagement with the concept somewhere in the mid-1950s. Pressed to define it, he said, "It means authority of the law, of the church, I suppose the monarch to a certain extent, and universities, and maybe the top brass of the Navy and the Army." He had read that Prince Philip was described as not quite part of the establishment, as a man who went very much on his own. The same description had been applied to Edward himself. He found that accurate. His father, George V, was unambiguously part of it. His brother, George VI, was too. Edward, by his own account, wasn't. He said he had collided with the establishment, to some extent, not very violently. That qualification matters as much as the claim itself. He wasn't describing a revolution. He was describing friction, slow, accumulated, unresolved friction between a man shaped entirely by the royalty he belonged to and a structure he found insufficiently flexible. He then made an argument that is harder to dismiss than it first appears. The collision, he suggested, might have helped the establishment. Its thinking needed periodically to be revived. The monarch could provide a little lead. The establishment had a conservative tendency that needed an occasional jolt from the top. Whether that is a sincere analysis or a retrospective justification is impossible to determine from the tape. But it shows that Edward wasn't simply presenting himself as a victim. He was presenting himself as potentially useful, a catalyst for the very institution he had failed to lead. Wallis gave the warmest version of her husband's character in the program. She said he had lots of pep, was very much ahead of his time, and wanted to establish things that Britain was not ready for, perhaps. Her words are valuable partly because they don't sound calculated in the way Edward's answers sometimes do. They sound like ordinary human description rather than prepared argument. She loved him, shared his exile, and had lived with the daily weight of 1936 for 34 years. She understood something about him that formal interviews never fully capture. She didn't specify which things Britain wasn't ready for. She didn't name reforms, identify proposals, or identify a moment when the country failed Edward by refusing modernization. Her testimony gives texture and emotional color to the portrait. It does not supply evidence for the historical argument. What it does accomplish is to complicate the simple story of Wallis Simpson as a single-minded villain whose ambition brought down a well-meaning king. Edward had his own frustrations with court life long before Wallis was central to it. He had his own belief in direct public contact, his own distaste for ceremony, his own sense that the institution needed adjustment. Wallis became the immediate surface on which those tensions were fought out. She wasn't their cause. But her testimony isn't a verdict. Being ahead of one's time can mean seeing a necessary change early. It can equally mean wanting a change without understanding its consequences or having the institutional means to achieve it. Edward's record gives evidence of both possibilities at once. He was unusually direct with the public. He was willing to go to places protocol didn't require and to say things protocol advised against. He saw social concern as part of the role. He was also unwilling to accept the political restraints that made constitutional monarchy acceptable to an elected government. He conflated the emotional authority of popularity with the constitutional authority of the crown. And when those came into conflict, as they inevitably did, he didn't have a workable answer. After December 1936, the question became what he was for. The answer arrived in August 1940. The Second World War had been underway for nearly a year. France had fallen. Churchill had become Prime Minister. Edward was in Lisbon, having passed through Spain, and the question of what to do with him had become pressing in ways that went beyond protocol. Churchill offered him the governorship of the Bahamas. Edward accepted. He arrived in Nassau on 17 August 1940 and formally began his term as governor and commander-in-chief on 18 August. He remained in the post until 30 April 1945, 4 years and 8 months, nearly 5 years. Government House, Nassau, became the official residence of a man who had once been expected to occupy Buckingham Palace. The physical distance between those addresses is about 4,300 miles. The institutional distance was harder to measure. The Bahamas in wartime wasn't a quiet backwater. It was a British colony with deep racial hierarchies, an economy distorted by wartime demands, and a population that had long-standing grievances about pay, conditions, and political representation. Those grievances came to a head in June 1942 when riots broke out in Nassau. Labor unrest that resulted in deaths, injuries, and significant property damage. The immediate cause was a dispute over the wages paid to Bahamian workers building American air bases, where a pay gap between white and black workers was substantial. The Duke of Windsor's handling of the crisis, the restoration of order, the response to workers' demands, and the reporting to London has been assessed with varying severity by historians. The available evidence does not produce a simple verdict, and the Harris interview does not address the 1942 riots at all. The program presents the governorship as a straightforward act of service. The full historical picture is more complicated. It's also more complicated for reasons the interview is careful not to mention. The timing and circumstances of the Bahamas appointment can't be separated from London's anxieties about Edward's political reliability in wartime Europe. He had met Hitler in 1937. He had been in Spain and Portugal when France fell. Captured German Foreign Office files recorded that German officials had entertained ideas about using him, ideas Edward later dismissed, but which were taken seriously enough in London to require an ocean between him and the European theater. The governorship kept him occupied, kept him distant, and kept him official. All three of those outcomes served British interests, regardless of whether they served Edward's. Wallis worked during the Nassau years. Available accounts connect her with the United Services Canteen in Nassau in 1943, and with canteen provision for forces personnel more broadly. The claim that she ran 2 RAF canteens and received a silver farewell box, leaving her nearly speechless at the presentation, belongs to the Windsor story as told in later accounts. The silver box, its inscription, its presenter, its appearance, and the emotional scene of its receipt can't be confirmed from the primary record currently available. What can be said is that she was active in wartime service work during those years, and that both Windsors treated this activity as evidence that their exile had been purposeful. When the interview turned to careers and what they might have done with different circumstances, Wallis said she had wished to be the head of an advertising agency. The remark is part of a larger exchange about unlived lives and unused possibilities. It sits next to Edward's account of the service he offered and never received. Two people in late middle age, in comfortable Paris exile, talking around the edges of what might have been. After leaving Nassau in April 1945, Edward expected to remain useful. That expectation became the final element of his grievance. Harris asked in the interview whether he would have liked another official role after the Bahamas. Edward's answer was flat. Yes, I offered my services if they were required. I never got any. Harris asked why. Edward gestured at unnamed obstructors. Most of the people, I'm afraid, are underground now who prevented me. He named no one. There is no confirmed record in the available material establishing when Edward made the offer, through which official channel, to what specific role, or who declined it on what grounds. His own account is that the decision was personal and made by people who have since died. The historical record can't verify or refute that version. What the historical record does show is that the British government, after 1945, had reasons beyond personal antagonism to be cautious about giving Edward a prominent public role. His wartime associations remained a matter of concern. The Marburg files, documents recording German discussions about his potential usefulness, had been studied by British officials. None of that appears in the Harris interview. Edward does not mention Germany. Harris does not press him on it. This is where the tape's authority has to be most carefully bounded. Many people arrive at Edward VIII's story expecting answers about his 1937 visit to Germany, his meeting with Hitler, the Marburg files, Operation Willy, and the allegations that surrounded his wartime conduct and contacts. Those subjects are historically serious. They affected how the British government assessed him for the rest of his life. They explain, in part, why the offer of further official service went unanswered. But the Kenneth Harris interview does not address them. Edward does not confront them on the tape. Harris does not press him. The collaboration allegations, the captured documents, the Nazi-era questions that historians and journalists have debated for decades, none of it enters the room at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in October 1969. The tape can't settle those questions because Edward does not raise them. A different program, relying on the wartime records and the declassified files, would be required. That would be a different film from this one. The silence does not disappear because Edward spoke movingly about unemployment. It does not disappear because Wallis called him ahead of his time. It does not disappear because he served in the Bahamas for nearly 5 years. It remains beyond the edges of this particular interview, shaping the audience's judgment of everything Edward chose not to address. There are other absences worth noting briefly. Edward and Wallis had no children. Their childlessness is sometimes folded into sentimental versions of the abdication, as though their love story somehow transformed the succession. The basic genealogy is straightforward. Edward's brother Albert became George VI in December 1936. George VI's elder daughter Elizabeth became Elizabeth II in February 1952. Since Edward and Wallis had no children, the succession would, in any case, have passed through his brother's line absent other changes. The abdication altered the immediate path to the throne. It didn't conjure Elizabeth II from nothing. And whatever sympathy Edward's account generates, one remark deserves to sit alongside it. George V had reportedly told a courtier, "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." He died in January 1936, before the abdication crisis began. He didn't live to see himself proved right, but his words reflect a serious institutional judgment, not about Wallis specifically, but about a particular man's fitness for a particular role. That judgment preceded the Wallis question entirely and shouldn't be dissolved by Edward's self-portrait. The Harris interview's final answer is also its clearest. Edward said he had no regrets, according to secondary coverage of the program. The answer is firm. The content remains opaque. That combination, a clear position without a complete explanation, is characteristic of everything Edward says in the 1969 program. For decades, the abdication has been told as a love story. A king gave up everything for the woman he loved. The broadcast of 11 December 1936 invited exactly that reading, and his abdication to marry Wallis was undeniably its immediate cause. The Paris interview shows that Edward himself found that version insufficient. It diminished him. It made the decision purely personal, the choice of a man who preferred love to duty. What he wanted the record to show was something else, that his relationship with the British establishment was already strained before Wallis became the issue, that the tension was structural rather than personal, and that the outcome wasn't accidental, but, in some sense, inevitable. He said the collision would have happened without the marriage. He said it would have happened even if he had remained a bachelor. He said he wanted to be an up-to-date king, not a grand reformer. He wanted the windows opened a little. He went to places where men had been out of work for a decade. He refused the symbolism of a Rolls-Royce in a poor district. He saw social concern as part of what a prince and a king should do. He kept his political ideas to himself because royal tradition required it. He served nearly 5 years in the Bahamas. He offered further service and says he received no answer. And he sat in Paris in October 1969, 33 years after the abdication, still reaching for his wife's hand when he needed to know the answer had been right. What the tape gives us is the most considered version of the case he made for himself. What it can't give us, and what he knew it couldn't, is the case the other side would make with evidence he chose not to address. Those conditions he never named. Those political conceptions he kept to himself. The questions Harris didn't ask and that Edward wasn't prepared to answer. Both cases are real. The tape delivers only one of them. The audience carries both.